Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of Sickles at Gettysburg, James Hessler.
James Hessler, author of Sickles at Gettysburg. When you were putting this book together, did you find yourself coming across things about Sickles that might have taken you off on a tangent that had nothing to do with Gettysburg?
Well, that's a good question. Yes and no, because one of the main theses of my book was that I wanted to focus on things specific to Gettysburg, whether that was things that he did during the battle or after the battle, but always kind of with the central premise of Gettysburg. But of course, with a guy like Sickles, who did so many things during his life, that danger of going off on these tangents certainly existed. That book easily could have been 600, 700, 800 pages if, I wanted to cover everything about him that I found interesting. And certainly, for example, the murder trial at the beginning of the book, that was a good example where I could have gone off on a lot of tangents, but I tried to stay focused on, some of the more important aspects of it, and then ultimately the aspects of it that drove him into the Army, which ultimately took him to Gettysburg.
Well, for viewers who don't know the story about Sickles, I heard you talk about the murder trial. We have to talk about that before we get to Gettysburg. What murder trial?
Right. Well, so one of the great aspects of the Sickles story is that his Civil War career, if you will, really kind of gets underway because in the late 1850s, while he was in Washington serving as a congressman, Mrs. Sickles, his young wife, was cheating on him. And probably many of the viewers know the basics of the story. She was having an affair with Philip Barton Key, who was the son of Francis Scott Key. Anyways, one day Congressman Sickles found out about the affair and in kind of an emotional panic, grabbed a couple of guns, confronted Mr. Key on the streets of Washington right in front of the White House and shot him dead. And in a lot of ways, that's really where my book starts. And I always tell people, how many other Civil War books could you read that would actually start off with, murder, adultery, and, that sort of scandal. But that's kind of where the book kind of kicks off.
He married his wife when she was 16 and pregnant, and he was 39?
Early 30s, yeah, I think probably around 32, 33.
And he was a member of Congress, and he just walked up to a guy on the street and shot him dead?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that was it. So if you have any familiarity with Washington, D.C., the Sickles lived on basically what's Lafayette Square right across from the White House. Sickles was a protege of, at the time, President Buchanan. So, they lived in a very prominent part of town. Key, on a warm Sunday afternoon in February of 1859, Key was basically hanging out in front of the Sickles house, waiting for Mrs. Sickles to, more or less come out and play. Sickles looked out the window, saw this, and, kind of the rest is history. Went out and confronted Key right on the street, shot him dead.
And the trial?
The trial. Well, so there was a, by the standards of the time, there was a very sensational murder trial. Now, I'm a battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park. One of the kind of cheap, easy jokes you can make on your tours is you can kind of refer to Dan Sickles as the O.J. Simpson of that era, because the Sickles trial really was kind of the O.J. trial of that era. Again, it had all these scandalous aspects that were going to appeal to people. So you had this great, highly covered murder trial. Sickles kind of assembled, for lack of a better word, this legal dream team, and this legal dream team came up with what's, been best remembered as the first successful temporary insanity defense ever used in United States history.
So he was not guilty?
He was found not guilty. He was found not guilty by reason of, again, quote-unquote, temporary insanity. One of the points that I make in the book is, though, if you go back and if you look at the press coverage from the trial and the press coverage after the trial, first of all, public opinion was resoundingly in Sickles' favor. You know, Key, the adulterer, was viewed as the bad guy. And they really had a hard time finding an impartial jury because the idea was that people, you know, as they were going into jury selection, people were saying that they really favored Sickles, you know, and thought Key got what he deserved. So even though it is best remembered for this temporary insanity defense, in reality he got off because the jury thought that, you know, he did the right thing, protecting his wife, who was, you know, at that time viewed as his, you know, property.
And then he reconciled with his wife.
Yes, he did. So that's you know, another one of these kind of head-scratching moments in the Dan Sickles story. Shortly, within only a few months of the verdict, Sickles and his wife reconciled, and it was really at that point that public opinion, which, as we said, had been in his favor, then turned against him. And people start to say, well, now, wait a minute. You know, if you can forgive your wife, you know, if you can kind of forgive this damaged woman, how, you know, why is it that you couldn't forgive Key? And at that point, that, you know, public opinion then really started to turn against Sickles. So it's kind of interesting to see, you know, what the moral temperament of the era was in terms of, you know, which is worse, murder, adultery, or forgiving your wife after she's cheated on you.
You also quote a biographer of Sickles in here as having evidence that Sickles' wife had an affair with Buchanan, James Buchanan.
Well, yeah, and I would I'd use the term evidence with a grain of salt. So one of the sources that I referred to in here was the research notes of one of Sickles' first biographers, a guy by the name of Edgecombe Pynchon, who had written a Sickles biography in the 1940s. I'm not a big fan of Pynchon's book, but his research notes are, fortunately for us, his research notes are fantastic, because one of the things he did was he still had access to people who knew Sickles in life, you know, and him and his researchers were able to interview them and kind of get their thoughts. But one of the comments that they had made, which again, I'm not sure if I believe, but they made the comment that, yeah, they thought Teresa Sickles and Buchanan did have an affair at one point, and that Sickles more or less kind of worked it for, you know, to advance his own career. So believe it or not.
Well, Sickles had apparently a checkered career going into up to this point in the murder, because you quote, when he arrived in Washington, he tried to arrange to get somebody fired so a friend of his could get a job, and was attacked by that person at the Willard Hotel in Washington, who began to whip him.
Right.
And then the attacker published a note in a New York paper claiming Sickles' whole career has been a series of unparalleled debaucheries. Graduating from the worst stinks of iniquity in this city, he has led the life of a professional vagabond, in debt to everyone. He stands before the public a disgraced and vanquished man.
Yeah, pretty much sounds like your typical elected official, right?
Well, yeah, he was elected to Congress, too.
Yeah, well, that, you know, he was, so, you know, if you think about the era, he really graduated, you know, from New York's Tammany Hall politics.
Now, what was Tammany Hall, people who don't know?
Tammany Hall was kind of, you know, this democratic political machine in New York City. I mean, it's best known today, you know, for boss tweed and images of corruption and that sort of thing. But, you know, Sickles had kind of graduated from that sort of life. And, you know, the campaigning and the politics of that era was, you know, probably much more violent and, you know, more politically incorrect than, you know, what we would expect today.
In fact, you quote a New York diarist, George Templeton, as saying, one might as well try to spoil a rotten egg as damage Dan's character.
Yeah, in another quote, Templeton Strong in another quote also refers to Dan as fetid gas, you know what I mean? So, you know, it's fun. The funny thing with Sickles is you can find examples of that where contemporaries just hate his guts. But you can also find a lot of people who obviously at some level must have thought very highly of him during his lifetime. You know, for him to go through the law profession and to go through politics and of course the Army and diplomatic service and all of this stuff, he's got a really long and varied career. So one of the things that really fascinated me about him was that you could have these two extremes. You know, how could a guy who's, you know, fetid gas also be elected to public office and rise to a high rank in the Army and go back to Congress after the war and do all this stuff? stuff that he did. And those are some of the aspects that really interested me about him, and hopefully as interesting readers too.
Well, he was also a Civil War officer on the Union side, but you say in Congress he tended to vote with the Southern Democrats.
Yeah, well, Sickles was a Democrat, and for folks at home, the Civil War. The Civil War, in a lot of ways, if you want to break it down, could be broken down as a war versus Republicans. Abraham Lincoln, Republican in the North, versus a lot of the leading Democrats of the South, who were in fact Democrats. So what happens is, initially before the war, Sickles is a Democrat. He's going to vote with his party, but ultimately, and this is one of the things that I like about Sickles and I think is an admirable trait, ultimately Sickles is, I do think his heart really is in the Union cause. So when
is or is not?
Is in the Union cause. So when the Southerners secede and the Civil War starts, a lot of that initial party support that Sickles would have had for the Democrats before the war, now obviously that turns into anger against a lot of these Democrats who have gone to the South, and he feels have kind of put his party in danger.
How did he end up in the Army?
Well, that's a long story, but he, as we touched on earlier, he takes his wife back. His public opinion, ratings shoot to the bottom. He doesn't run for re-election. So basically, when the Civil War starts, Sickles is now out of Congress and back home in New York practicing law as a private citizen. Now there's a lot of different variations on what happens next. And again, like a lot of what you see when trying to analyze these historical accounts is you got to kind of, pay your admission and decide which one you're going to pick to believe and which one you're not going to believe. But the basic premise is he goes back to New York and he decides to raise troops from his home state of New York. He raises troops, what eventually becomes known as the Excelsior Brigade. And then again, and this is where the roads get a little muddied as far as what happens next. But at some point, he seems to enlist the support of Abraham Lincoln, who, likes Sickles' initiative, and also Lincoln, is starting up kind of this unpopular war effort. Lincoln needs the support of Democrats. Even a disgraced and sullied one like Dan Sickles is better than no support at all. So for lack of a better word, Lincoln and Sickles kind of get into bed and mutually support each other, and that's ultimately going to help Sickles get into the Army and rise through the ranks.
Did he raise the Army before he was in the Army? I mean, did it raise the troops?
Yeah, so...
How do you do that?
Well, in the Civil War, especially in the early days, there's the call for volunteers. It's a volunteer army. He sees an opportunity where if he goes out and, he can, in fact, raise troops, typically, if you're going to command a brigade of troops, you might expect that, you're ultimately going to become commissioned as at least a one-star general. So, that's kind of the nature of the Civil War, at least again in the early stages. Volunteers raising troops.
So he could show up to the Army and say, here, I have so many soldiers who have signed up with me, make me an officer.
In essence, yeah, but what happens is, as he starts raising troops, old political opponents of his, and this is where you have to wonder if they're either questioning his lack of military qualification, his reputation, or, some aspect of his, political positions. But at that point, political opponents do kind of start saying, "Whoa, time out! Stop the presses. We don't need the Excelsior Brigade brought into service." And there are efforts to actually try to stop his efforts and disband the brigade. That's a good example again where he has to go to Washington and tell Lincoln, "Look, President Lincoln, you need troops. I'm here. I got troops. Let's kind of get together and make the deal happen." Ultimately, then, when it comes time for the Senate and that to confirm his nomination as a general, in a couple of instances it will get held up and almost not get through. Ultimately, he'll become a general by only one vote in the Senate. So it's not an easy road for him.
Was he a crook? I mean, you refer to him as a lawyer of questionable practices. I think is the phrase you used.
Yeah, I mean. Sure, by our standards, maybe you would say yeah, because he's got in his background, he's got allegations of embezzlement, obtaining money under false pretense is. Before he'd gotten married, he was well known to cavort with a kind of a notorious prostitute in New York City by the name of Fanny White,
who he introduced to the Queen.
Supposedly, that's one of the great Sickles urban legends, that they got introduced to the Queen. And then there was perhaps some allegations that he was kind of taking in money for her services. So from that point of view, I guess I would have to say, yeah, we would probably consider him a crook.
So when he showed up to the Army saying, I have all these troops, make me an officer, what did he know about being an officer?
Well, that's the problem. Probably not much. And that's not necessarily unique to the Civil War. But in his case, he didn't have any military training. He did have some militia service, in the pre-war days, like a lot of prominent men of the era. He did kind of sign up for his local militia. But what did that really mean? Okay, you impress the ladies with your uniform and your big sword, and you go out on parade on Sunday afternoon, and maybe you drill. So from the point of view of warfare and tactics and strategy, when the war began, Sickles, like a lot of these other guys, was really unprepared for what he was going to find himself into.
How did he get along with the other officers, the West Point officers and the real Army officers?
Yeah, that's a big theme of my book, is kind of the clique in the Army of the Potomac, which was the Union Army, but the cliques in the Army between, what we refer to today as kind of the professionals, the West Pointers, and, the amateurs, or in Sickles' case, the political generals. There was definitely a gulf between these guys. From the point of view of the West Pointers, they're looking at, they've been training for the military their whole life. They've probably spent, boring decades serving out on the frontier, and all of a sudden you have this, acquitted murderer, ex-congressman coming in, and you're the same rank, right? I mean, obviously there was, one thing that hasn't changed then is now we don't like politicians messing with our affairs. So there was definitely a lot of resentment against Sickles because of that. But on the other side of the house, Sickles and some of his friends, to them, they viewed the West Pointers as being unaggressive and unassertive. And there's some quotes in there, where they call these guys the engineer clique. The West Point curriculum had really focused on building field fortifications and stuff like that. And to a lot of these amateurs and to a lot of people, in the newspapers and Congress, they're kind of looking at these West Pointers as not being aggressive enough and not pursuing the war aggressively. Now, I'm not saying we want Congress and the newspapers to fight our wars for us, because of course we don't, but that hopefully gives you an idea of, kind of the gulf between these two sides.
Did he keep his relationship going with Abraham Lincoln throughout the war? I mean, did people know, oh yeah, you can't touch Sickles because he's Lincoln's buddy?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and I use a couple of quotes in the book where you have people in the Army watching, with disgust as Sickles can apparently go to Washington and call on the Lincolns at all hours, because one of the things that happens is not only does he remain in good standing with Abraham Lincoln, but he becomes very friendly with Mary Todd Lincoln. So, and there's a number of instances, where they're going out to matinees together. He's at the White House for dinner and that sort of thing. And yeah, there was, and the guys like Frank Haskell just in the Army just watching in disgust, as this seems to be allowed to happen.
Did he ever go over his supervisor's head to Lincoln?
Oh yeah, sure. There's a number of instances, prior to Gettysburg, when he's serving under Joe Hooker and some of those guys, but especially then, kind of after Gettysburg, when, technically he's still in the Army, but, he's calling on Lincoln and kind of talking to Lincoln, about what he's, perceives to be General Meade's shortcomings, and that sort of thing. And again, one of the things that's interesting about the Civil War is, again, that was not unique to Sickles by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a political process in place that, yeah, he certainly milked and, took advantage of for all it was worth.
Who were his allies in the Army?
Well, his biggest ally is a general by the name of Joe Hooker. So Joe Hooker was a West Pointer, and prior to Gettysburg, in 1862-ish, Sickles served under Hooker's command. Now, even though Hooker is a West Pointer, Hooker, he's a very ambitious, kind of a conniving sort of guy, on his own. He's, looking for opportunities to kind of rise through the ranks, and, sometimes that means you got to knock other people down. But at a social level, Hooker is he's a well-known drinker, although I want to emphasize, I don't think he's, drinking really interferes with his Army duties with the Army of the Potomac. But nevertheless, in social settings, he's well known as a drinker. He's also well known as a heavy womanizer. So you have Hooker the drinker and the womanizer. He now hooks up with Sickles, who, although I don't think Sickles was a heavy drinker, Sickles is obviously a well-known womanizer. And then they hook up with a third guy, a guy from New York by the name of Dan Butterfield. Now, Butterfield, probably likes women as much as the rest of them. Butterfield also had arson in his background. Okay, so for the scorecard here, we got womanizing, murdering, drinking, and arson. And these three guys are kind of setting the social calendar in the Army of the Potomac in the months leading up to Gettysburg.
Sickles was a drinker?
No, I don't. Yes and no. I mean, again, I think from the notes that I saw, what they basically said was, that he would enjoy himself on social occasions, but that in general, he was not what you would consider a heavy drinker. And one of his chaplains actually said that Sickles actually really frowned upon, getting too drunk. So I think Sickles, would like to party in the modern vernacular, but I wouldn't consider him a heavy drinker.
Oh, toward the end of your book, you describe a scene in Atlanta well after the war that Sickles and General Longstreet, generals from the opposite sides, are drunk stumbling down the street in Atlanta.
Yeah, that whole thing between Sickles and Longstreet was one of the many aspects of the Sickles story that I found interesting, because Sickles and Longstreet, they're two controversial guys because of their roles at the Battle of Gettysburg and at various points in the Civil War. But yeah, so one of the stories that we tell in the book is, they became friends after the war because they could both kind of mutually support each other. If you criticized Longstreet, Sickles could kind of come in and defend Longstreet, and then if you criticized Sickles, Longstreet could kind of come in and defend Sickles. But yeah, there was a story, it was St. Patrick's Day in the early 1890s on the streets of Atlanta. They were kind of going back and forth. They'd been at the St. Patrick's Day party, and Sickles had, gotten Longstreet so drunk that he got Longstreet to sing the Star-Spangled Banner to this audience of old Confederate veterans. Then afterwards, they're walking each other back and forth to their hotel. Neither one wants to kind of leave the other one, and Sickles, a drunken Sickles supposedly says something to the effect of, Longstreet, I guess I'm going to have to forgive you for shooting one of my legs off, and Longstreet says something like, forgive me, you ought to thank me for leaving you one leg to stand on. So, there were a lot of anecdotes like that in the book, trying to get a feel for, what these two guys were doing, after the war, defending each other.
What would you give to have heard a conversation between those two?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess like Sickles, maybe I would have given my right leg, but probably not that extreme. But
so the Civil War starts, and his unit is activated. Where do they start?
Yeah.
Where do they see their first fighting?
Well, they get activated shortly after the first Battle of Bull Run. For the most part, Sickles himself starts to see action in the 7 days battles. But what I focus on in the book is really from late 1861 through the end of 1862. You will see the Civil War battles progressively getting bigger and messier, and the pre-Gettysburg battles that I specifically focus on in the book being Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. These battles start getting bigger, and unfortunately, after the 7 days battle, Sickles goes to New York to recruit, and really for the most part, for the late summer to early fall of 1862, when you have two large battles at Second Manassas and Antietam, Sickles is away from the Army recruiting. So his men are getting some fighting experience throughout 1862, but he's gone. And I think that's important because even though he's gone with his connections with Joe Hooker, Lincoln, and the newspapers, Sickles is going to leapfrog, get himself promoted pretty quickly, from what would be a brigade command to a division command and then ultimately to a corps command without seeing any combat experience in between. I think, you can really only judge this on the 7 days because that's all we have to work with, but I think My take on Sickles is he had the ability and the mental, the street smarts to make himself a pretty good brigade commander. You did not need to have a West Point education to be successful in the Civil War. But, again, as I said, he leapfrogs from brigade to division to command when a little bit of training and a little bit of experience would have come in handy. And I think ultimately that's going to be his biggest military downfall.
How big is a brigade and division in a corps?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, sort of some round numbers. Let's say at the time of Gettysburg, a brigade might be roughly 1,500 men. Let's say a division is 4,000 to 5,000 men. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the Third Corps that Sickles commands is about 11,000 men. Some corps are bigger than that, but that kind of gives you an idea of the numbers we're talking about.
How did he handle himself when he was under fire?
According to him, very well.
I mean, from real bullets and not political fire.
Yeah, exactly. If he says that I actually have an account in there where he talks about the first time that he was under fire, and he emphasizes how coolly he kind of reacted to it. Well, okay, but what did other people say? Most of the other accounts that we seem to have seem to, for the most part, never question his bravery, never question his aggressiveness. And aggressiveness can be a good thing or a bad thing if you're too aggressive in the wrong situation. But he seems to react under fire with, for the most part, coolness and aggressive action, aggressive decision making.
What are his recollections of his performance like?
Well, depending on, obviously you can imagine his recollections are very favorable. He a number of quotes that I talk about in there, especially through the 1880s and the 1890s, when he was coming back to Gettysburg and giving speeches and being asked these sorts of questions. General Sickles, what do you think of your performance at Gettysburg? And he would repeatedly say, and this is one of the things I personally like about him, how dogged he is and stubborn. He would say, what, I've reviewed this battle. I've had decades to review what I did at this battle. The people who criticize me don't know what they're talking about. I was happy with the part I played, and I would do today, exactly what I did back then. So he never once apologized for what he did.
And other people call his recollections outright lies.
Yeah. And there's where especially the lies come in is when you start talking about what he did at Gettysburg. And, there's this whole debate on the morning of July 2nd, the second day of the battle. He decides to either misinterpret General Meade's orders or his critics think intentionally disobey General Meade's orders. But he does all this, and he moves essentially out of position as much as, say, 3/4 of a mile out of position, so that when the fighting begins on July 2nd, General Meade and the Union Army's entire left flank is out of position. In having to defend himself against criticism from that in later years, one of the key things he had done, for example, was he had left Little Round Top, which, today at least is acknowledged as, the key to the left flank of the Union Army. We could have a whole nother debate about that. But, in trying to address criticism of that, he would have to resort to lies and say things like, what are you talking about? I occupied Little Round Top. I made sure we got reinforcements up there. And he had to do a lot of things like that to, kind of put the spin on his Gettysburg performance.
Backing up a little bit to just before the battle, you say in your book that he, on his own volition, took his army to Gettysburg. They were at Emmetsburg?
Well, yeah. So on July 1st, the first day of the battle, he is at Emmetsburg. At that point in the battle, General Meade is still, in the process of concentrating the Union Army and still trying to figure out where the Union Army is going to fight. At that point of the game, it is not, there's no guarantee that we're ultimately going to concentrate and have this huge battle at Gettysburg. So Sickles, on the 1st of July, is positioned at Emmetsburg, probably to guard a potential move around the Union left flank. If Lee and the Confederates, who were to the west, had kind of swept maybe further south, they could have potentially outflanked the Union Army at Emmetsburg and kind of cut through there. So the bottom line is Sickles is guarding what could be a key position at Emmetsburg.
How far is Emmetsburg from Gettysburg?
Oh, I don't know, 10, 12 miles or so. So they, as they get in there, into Emmitsburg, Sickles starts receiving orders from General John Reynolds, who is moved forward to Gettysburg and is basically in action. Reynolds is telling Sickles, I think you better come forward. So Sickles becomes very confused. Does he stay at Emmitsburg, where he thinks General Meade wants him to be? Does he move forward to Gettysburg, where he thinks General Reynolds wants him to be? He's going to spend the first day, a good portion of the first day of the battle, agonizing over this. Ultimately, he will move forward to Gettysburg, and a favorite spin topic of his later will be that he'll tell people, I marched to the sound of the guns, I moved forward to Gettysburg, I did the right thing in disobedience to General Meade, who wanted me to stay back on a line in the rear. So it's a way Sickles could spin the story to make himself look aggressive and make General Meade look, kind of timid and indecisive at the same time.
Was there real confusion at the top, and was he getting conflicting orders, or was he just a troublemaker?
I think, this is an area where people would disagree with me. And I think, and hopefully people who've read the book and are watching, will appreciate that I've gone to great pains in the book to not quote unquote take a side, because when this book was announced, a lot of people hate Sickles because of the type of guy he is and stuff that he did. And I think when this book was announced, there was a lot of great skepticism that I was going to kind of just, print this apology for Sickles and defend everything he did. And I don't do that in the book. Having said that, I think in answer to this specific question, yeah, I think you can make a case that there is legitimate confusion. At the end of the day, he's getting orders from multiple people, and I think anybody, regardless of whether you've ever been to West Point or in the Army, anybody who works in an organization today can relate to that. If you're getting, instructions from two bosses, it can become very confusing if the two of them are telling you, different things to do. So yes, I think the confusion was legitimate. The Sickles critics out there, and there are legions of them, the Sickles critics out there would disagree with me and say, no, he's a troublemaker, it should have been clear. But, I think you have to remove a lot of hindsight from the decision-making. We've had 140-odd years to study the battle. If you just limit yourself to what was happening at the time and the conflicting instructions he was getting, absolutely, I think, some of the confusion was justified.
Did you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Sickles before you started this book?
Well, I wasn't sure, and that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Favorable, unfavorable, I certainly found him interesting. Again, the murderer who rises to high command in the Army and then sets off this great controversy. To me, I mean, that's a no-brainer as far as finding him interesting. The standard dogma on the Battle of Gettysburg is that he made a mistake and that he was wrong. I'd pretty much fallen into line with that argument. But as a person, do I find favorable or unfavorable? Again, it's mixed. There's qualities of him that I really like. His stubbornness, I like his ambition. One of the things I point out in the book is he gets knocked down and you think he's kind of left for dead at a number of points in his career. And he always kind of moves the chess pieces on the board, to kind of get himself back up on his feet again. I like that. People may not like that, but I like that. So there's a number of aspects of his personality that I do find favorable. On the other side of the ledger, I think more than anything today, people hate him for the post-war attacks that he made on General Meade's reputation. Meade is generally viewed today as a good, solid guy, and you have kind of Sickles, this political monster, this windbag, this fetid gas, this murderer, kind of seemingly lying his way through the historical record to kind of beat up on Meade's reputation. So that's the other side of the ledger.
Why didn't he and Meade get along?
Two very different guys. I touched on kind of the Sickles partying aspects earlier on. I think Meade is very much the opposite of that. Meade is more the conservative, happily married kind of guy. So I think to start with, they're two very different guys. Then you have this whole gulf, Meade the West Pointer, Sickles the political general. And then if that weren't bad enough, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, there is a direct dispute where Sickles' buddy Joe Hooker gets into a dispute with Meade over, whether or not they should have retreated after Chancellorsville. Sickles falls into line with Hooker and against Meade. And then last but not least, Meade had some personality conflicts with one of Sickles' friends in the Third Corps, a guy by the name of General David Birney. So you put all that together and it's kind of just a disaster waiting to happen.
Now, you mentioned that you're a guide at Gettysburg.
Yes.
Is it full-time, part-time, hobby?
Part-time. So I'm employed. I'm employed full-time in another world, kind of the banking and financial industry. Which is kind of a dirty word to a lot of people in of itself today. But so I do that full-time, and I've been a part-time guide at Gettysburg since 2003, and I do that on weekends and throughout the spring, summer, and fall.
How do people employ your services? How do they find you?
Well, what happens is, so there's a licensed battlefield guide program at Gettysburg where we're in essence contractors through the National Park Service, and what people do is if you come to Gettysburg, with your family, we really feel the best way to see the battlefield is to take a tour, hire a licensed battlefield guide, and we will go in the car with you and show you around the battlefield and answer your questions and, tell you stories for 2 hours.
What do you have to do to get a license?
Well, what the Park Service does is, the Park Service is very, regiment. They want to make sure that obviously people that come here are getting factual information and that they're dealing with, guides who can communicate the facts of the battle. So the Park Service holds, it's a pretty tough written and oral examination process every couple of years. So you take a comprehensive written exam, not only on the Battle of Gettysburg, but the history of Gettysburg and the Civil War itself. For those of us then who pass the written exam, then you go on to this oral exam where you get in the car with a couple of park rangers and they beat you up basically for a couple of hours to, see how well you can handle it. And then if you get through all that,
Is it a tough test?
Yeah, it is. It is. A lot of people. It's fun. It's kind of funny to watch, but especially when you get to the oral part of it, you'll actually see people get so stressed out by that part of the exam that they'll actually drop out. They'll throw their years of studying out the window. Kind of because they can't handle the stress of doing it. So it can be a very tough exam. My advice to people is I always tell them, okay, take a deep breath. We're not curing cancer. Just take a deep breath. We're battlefield guides. Have fun with it. Try to tell a good story. Try to be factually accurate. And just have fun and go with it. But
How did you study for it?
mostly just reading. You read and, they offer some various prep classes or that sort of thing. But you're reading, basically, you meet up with other people who kind of have similar interests and you bounce questions off of each other and you walk the battlefield together and you kind of try out your tours on each other and that sort of thing. And that's been one of the best parts of the experience is kind of meeting. You get to meet a lot of people who, would have a similar interest to you because obviously, that level of Gettysburg knowledge is not something you're just going to find in everyday life, while you're standing at the supermarket or something.
What made you want to focus so much attention on Gettysburg in particular?
Well, I'd been a Gettysburg enthusiast, I guess I would say, since probably the early 90s. I mean, it's hard to say now, it's hard to imagine now, but I guess it's been almost 15, 20 years, and I don't feel that old. But one year for Christmas, somebody had given me the book, The Killer Angels, which is probably all of us know is a well-known Civil War novel. Somebody had given me that one year for Christmas, and, I became kind of hooked and fascinated by the Gettysburg story, and people criticize something like The Killer Angels because it's only a novel, but, it did encourage me to kind of want to learn the true story and to learn more about it. So you just kept reading books and that sort of thing. And I'd gotten in, like a lot of middle managers in my banking and financial gig, I had gotten relocated around the country on a number of different occasions. And my wife and I kind of always had our eye open for an opportunity to move to Gettysburg. And about 10 years ago, I found a job opportunity that allowed us to do that.
Is this your first book?
Yes, it is. I've done a few prior magazine articles, but that's the first book.
Well, we're about 2/3 of the way through this, and your book is entitled Sickles at Gettysburg, and we barely talked about Sickles at Gettysburg. So can you paint the picture on, was it July 2nd? And
yeah.
He's at Little Round Top?
Well, so July 2nd, which again is the second day of the battle. So on the first day of the battle, the Union Army has been defeated, and they're kind of retrenching on Cemetery Ridge. As fate would have it, on the morning of the 2nd, Sickles and his 3rd Army Corps, which is again about 11,000 men, are on what is essentially going to be the left flank, the left end of the Union battle line. So General George Meade, commanding the Union Army that morning, tells Sickles to basically hold the flank and basically put your flank and your line on that hill way down at the end of the line that we know today is Little Round Top. Okay, so that's kind of where the story starts at Gettysburg. Sickles, though, in kind of getting into that position, tells a couple of stories, and this is where you got to kind of, again, decide which one you believe. He says he's not sure where he's supposed to go, and he doesn't like where he's supposed to go. He sees a position that's, again, about 3/4 of a mile out in front of the main Union line. Sickles sees that, decides that's a better position to put his Third Corps in. And although, and again, I don't think his critics give him credit for this, I think he does try to communicate some of his issues back to headquarters and to General Meade, but ultimately throughout the course of the early afternoon, Sickles will move his Third Corps forward, put the entire left flank of the Union Army out of position so that when General Lee and General Longstreet's Confederate attack begins in the afternoon, Meade has got big problems because his left flank is out of position and he's got to scramble to reinforce it.
So the Peach Orchard is a battle that Meade didn't expect to have happen?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, if you kind of look at Sickles' positioning during the course of the battle, three very famous place names that exist today, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, and the Peach Orchard, all really exist because Sickles moved out of position. Meade did not intend to have any troops in those areas. Sickles had other ideas, so that when the Confederate attack, kind of hits Sickles' line in those three places, they were areas that Meade did not expect to have his troops in. They were areas then that Meade did not expect to have to defend.
Well, Little Round Top is up high, and the Peach Orchard is down lower. What was the advantage that Sickles saw in being down lower?
Well, that's a good question. So, and that's one of the things that people have been debating about for all these decades. The issue is kind of, it's high and low, but it's also the difference between being back and moving forward. So the Peach Orchard does sit on an elevation today along the Emmitsburg Road. Now, it's not nearly as high as Little Round Top, but it is an elevation in of itself. One of the things we debate is we think, Sickles wanted to move forward to the Peach Orchard. He said one of the things he wanted to do was give more room for his artillery to maneuver, because in the initial position that Meade wanted him to be in, Sickles and his artillery officers said they didn't have enough room basically to effectively use their artillery. So Sickles thought by moving forward, he would basically kind of get more room to move his troops and his artillery, kind of get out in front of the line and get a better view of the Confederate attack as it was forming. So those are kinds of the types of things that Sickles is saying, are why he moved out of position. Again, to your earlier question, there's people watching at home tonight who are going to say, oh, that's all nonsense. Sickles is a troublemaker and he's just looking to create trouble. Obviously I can't prove that, but I don't think that's the case.
How fast could he move 10,000, 11,000 men?
Well, it takes place over a couple of hours. So over the course of, let's say, roughly 1 o'clock in the afternoon to nearly 3:30 in the afternoon on July 2nd. Those are rough times. Of course, we don't know the exact, but he's in the process of moving his corps forward. And other guys in the Army are supposedly watching, the entire left flank move out of position, and are really kind of bewildered and saying, what on earth is Sickles and what are those guys doing? Unfortunately, Meade doesn't seem to find out about it until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when his chief engineer basically comes up to headquarters and tells him that, hey, you better go take a look. We got problems down on the Third Corps front.
Well, now in the Killer Angels book and in the movie Gettysburg, the dramatic scene is the Maine. What was the number of the
20th Maine?
20th Maine,
yes.
Valiantly defending Little Round Top. How did they get there, and
well, that's
where did the Confederates come from to attack them?
Yeah, that's one of the things I always like to remind 20th Maine fans. You wouldn't have Chamberlain and the 20th Maine come into the rescue at the last minute if it weren't for Dan Sickles. So, if you're a Chamberlain fan, you at least owe Sickles that. But I mean, basically what had happened, so, Little Round Top is essentially unoccupied of infantry. Meade finds out about it, now has to start scrambling to get reinforcements up on the hill. So as they're kind of sending out couriers throughout the Union lines to get people up to reinforce the left flank, one of the messages falls in the hands of a guy from Erie, Pennsylvania, a colonel by the name of Strong Vincent. Serving under Strong Vincent is Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. Vincent puts his troops up on Little Round Top. The 20th Maine basically ends up being the left end of the line, kind of holding the end of the hill. As the Confederates, or as Longstreet's Confederates, are breaking through Sickles' battle line, they basically outflank Sickles at Devil's Den and basically start to work their way up Big Round Top and then ultimately over to Little Round Top. Chamberlain, among many other units, has to defend the hill, and if we've seen the movie, the rest is more or less history.
And what happened to Sickles when he got his soldiers down to the peach orchard?
Well, I think they fought as valiantly as they could. I think the ultimate, and again, this is the thing that Gettysburg enthusiasts like to debate over, the strengths and the weaknesses of Sickles' position. I think, in my mind, the ultimate weakness of Sickles' position is he moves into a line that's too long for his troops to hold. He doesn't have enough men to hold it. So what happens is, as the Confederates are slamming into him, basically I think his men do some valiant fighting. I think they do about the best they can with it. But ultimately, his entire line is crushed by General Longstreet's troops. So his men fall back again from Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. They're going to fall back. And the Confederates are going to kind of steamroll then, but, the Confederates, if you can say something in his favor, in Sickles' favor, the Confederates do suffer heavy casualties capturing these positions from Sickles. These positions are ultimately going to hold no value to the Confederates and ultimately winning the Battle of Gettysburg. So again, these are, kinds of the who was right and who was wrong, sort of debates.
Did Sickles exercise poor generalship in the way he set up his troops when he got to Peach
Yeah,
Orchard?
There's a quote in there, and I forget who said it, that a good leader, a good military leader has to kind of show aggressive temperament, but he also has to show sound judgment. And Sickles is, certainly guilty in a good way, I think, of aggressive temperament. He wants to get out there and he wants to fight the rebels, but ultimately the judgment is certainly questionable. Again, with the defects of the position, he moves out. He doesn't really give the rest of the Union Army an opportunity to kind of coordinate and reinforce them until it's nearly too late.
But you also say in the book that ultimately he outguessed Lee in where Lee was going to strike, and Longstreet said that he would rather, something to the effect that he would rather Sickles' troops not have been where they were.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the points they make in the book is, if you look at Robert E. Lee's objectives for the second day at Gettysburg, Lee and Longstreet clearly seem to be saying that one of the points they want to capture is the peach orchard, because it is an elevated artillery platform along the Emmitsburg Road. They can get their cannons up there and supposedly, hit Cemetery Ridge. So that seems to be one of the objectives in the attack. Sickles, and some people think, he does a good job of outguessing Lee. Other people think Sickles is just plain lucky. Other people think Sickles is just making it all up later. But luck or not, Sickles does at least move forward into the peach orchard, take this position that Longstreet was expecting to occupy. Now Longstreet's going to have to fight his way through it, and again, suffer heavier casualties in the process. But again, depending on where you kind of fall in the Sickles story, he either successfully outguessed Lee or he was just plain lucky in doing that.
So they retreated from Peach Orchard?
Ultimately, they do. Ultimately, he's driven out of the Peach Orchard. The Confederates, Longstreet's troops, will take and hold the Peach Orchard for the remainder of the 2nd and also in through most of the 3rd. So when they launch Pickett's charge on July 3rd, they actually are using the Peach Orchard as an artillery platform to hit the Union lines, but ultimately to no benefit, in driving the Union Army out of their main position on Cemetery Ridge.
And Sickles is wounded?
Yes, Sickles is wounded. So during the early evening of July 2nd, while he's rallying the troops, a artillery shell comes, smashes into his leg. He's carried off the field, and that night at a field hospital, his leg is amputated, effectively ending his military career.
You say, legend tells us that in one last act of bravado, Sickles was escorted from the field while theatrically chomping on a cigar and inspiring his men to hold their ground.
Yeah, that's the legend. So one of the great urban legends associated with Sickles is, there's this image that he's badly wounded. He wants to kind of steady the men and have them keep fighting. And one of the great images associated with Sickles in the second day of Gettysburg was always the story of him kind of going off, smoking his cigar and, telling the guys, hey, I'm all right, keep fighting, it's not so bad. So when I started out in my research, I thought like a lot of people that was kind of a cool and an interesting story. All I really wanted to do was collect some primary accounts and try to write a good version of that. Because again, if you go back to some of the books that had been previously published, a lot of them were kind of telling that story using secondhand accounts and that sort of thing. So I kind of just wanted to get back to basics. The problem was that whenever I looked at, primary accounts of that story, they didn't really talk about the cigar and coolly smoking and that. They talked about, him being badly wounded. There's one account that says, he's telling him, don't let me get taken prisoner and tie up my leg before I bleed to death. And another one of his staff officers comes and says, we're just basically doping him up and pumping him full of stimulants. So people didn't talk about the cigar story. So ultimately what I ended up writing in the book was very different from kind of the traditional version of that. But I didn't start out intending for it to be that way, but you got to just, kind of go where you think your research takes you.
You said the injury effectively ended his military career, but you have a photograph in here of him with one leg in uniform surrounded by other officers.
Well, yeah, so the loss of his leg does effectively end his battlefield career. What happens is he will spend the next couple of months recuperating. In October of 1863, he will make an effort to rejoin the Army. General Meade, who again, probably hates his guts, is probably ticked off over what happens at Gettysburg. Meade kind of, uses the missing leg as an excuse and tells Sickles, well, I don't really think you're fit for service, and doesn't really let Sickles come back into the Army. So the battlefield end of his career is done. But one of the interesting things about Sickles, though, is from July 2nd, 1863 until the end of his life, Sickles is again kind of respin himself as this one-legged war hero, this military man, this military veteran, attending, dedications and reunions as, kind of the hero of Gettysburg.
I want to read you this part about a time when Sickles met Mark Twain, and they spent an evening talking, and Twain said, I noticed then that the general valued his lost leg away and above the one that is left. I am perfectly sure that if he had to part with either of them, he would part with the one that he has got.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. I love that quote. I think it sums it up. It's interesting to note that Sickles did apparently learn to use an artificial leg. You never see him using it in photos. It's always, one leg in the crutches. And when you look at his, whether it be a monument dedication speech or a newspaper interview, he's always talking about, look at the sacrifice I made. Look at the sacrifice I made for the country and for the Union and for Gettysburg, and that sort of thing. So I like Twain's quote because I think it sums it up pretty accurately.
And you have a photograph in the book of his leg bone?
Yeah, people love that photo.
Is it on display?
It is. It's been at Walter Reed in Washington for a number of decades. That's a great photo. If I'm at a book signing or something and somebody's kind of on the fence about whether or not they want to buy the book, they always ask about the leg. If I turn to that photo, they see the leg and they're hooked. There's something about that leg, and it was on display at a museum, and one of the urban legends are that he would go and visit the leg. For whatever reason, people seem to love that story.
There was a lot of finger pointing involved after the Battle of Gettysburg, where Sickles said that he thought Meade didn't intend to fight at Gettysburg or planned to retreat. You call it the Second Battle of Gettysburg.
Right.
Who won that one?
Well, I think historically General Meade has clearly won the Second Battle of Gettysburg. You can kind of debate over. At the time, I don't really think there were any winners. Sickles didn't get what he wanted. Sickles, more than anything, wanted to come back to the Army, and he never got that. So he certainly didn't win it. General Meade, Meade's name and reputation got dragged through the mud, and at the time, it caused Meade a lot of job stress and personal stress. But fast forwarding, 140 odd years later, clearly Meade won. Historically, Meade won the Second Battle of Gettysburg. 99% of Civil War and Gettysburg enthusiasts today, if they were to take a side, would take Meade's side, and he clearly won that battle.
Sickles was around for a long time after the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah, he attended. He attended right up through the 50th anniversary of the battle in July 1913, and died a few months after that. But he was around for a long time, and that was a great opportunity for him because he just kept coming back to battlefields. Gettysburg in particular, but other battlefields. And he just gave him an opportunity to just keep telling and telling and telling that story. That he was the hero. Meade wanted to retreat. He moved forward to prevent Meade from retreating, and just respinning that, for audiences for decades. So he really used that to his advantage and became really a celebrity because of that in his own right. I mean, as you pointed out, Mark Twain, was a pretty famous guy too, right? Mark Twain devoted a large portion of his memoirs to meeting Dan Sickles. I mean, that tells you to me how famous Sickles was.
How much of his time did he spend on battlefield preservation?
Well, I think as far as Gettysburg is concerned, at least quite a bit. So in the 1880s, he became chairman of the New York Monuments Commission, and their role was to kind of mark the battle lines and kind of place the monuments to New York troops on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And he was very committed and very devoted to that. And numerous accounts, you keep seeing him coming back to Gettysburg, to try to participate in that. So I think he was very, very active in that role. And then the other piece that I talk about in the book is, of course, in the in the early 1890s, the Gettysburg battlefield has been under the threat of various aspects of commercial development.
You use the phrase that there was a threat of blasting Devil's Den to make way for trolley tracks.
Yeah. As most Gettysburg enthusiasts know, there was a trolley line that kind of ran over much of Sickles' battle line, and one of the areas that it ran through was Devil's Den. To go through that area, they had to blast a number of rocks, and Sickles and a lot of the Third Corps veterans, were particularly upset by that. So that was the sort of thing that Sickles really was committed to kind of fighting against, and ultimately that was one of the reasons why, as a congressman, he introduced the legislation that created Gettysburg National Military Park. And I find it, a little ironic today. I think at the end of his life, Sickles did some really good things for the Gettysburg battlefield. But the Gettysburg enthusiasts today, people who come back to that battlefield and love going there, and in some cases, actually owe their living to the Gettysburg battlefield, a lot of times people don't want to give, at least if nothing else, give him his due for that. And this is an area of the Sickles story that, I thought I focused on much more than some of the prior biographies, because I thought in particular they had kind of overlooked that.
Although you do say he was accused of raking off some money from the New York Monument Fund.
Well, yeah, with Sickles it's never easy, is it?
A rascal to the end.
Exactly. Right to the end, he's going to give you a hard time. So what happened was, shortly before the 50th anniversary of the battle, New York State did an audit of the Monuments Commission's books, and they found something to the effect of $28,000 unaccounted for. Chairman Sickles couldn't figure out where the money was, and while all this was going on, Sickles was going through a very messy public sort of scandal with his second wife. She was trying to get his housekeeper kicked out of the house. He was going bankrupt. There was no, foreclosure. It was just a really messy story. And then on top of all this, you had this money missing from the New York Monuments Commission. So yeah, he was a problem child right to the bitter end.
How long did he live?
Well, he died shortly after the 50th anniversary of the battle, 1914, and depending on, there's some debate over when he was born. So depending on where you want to go, he was somewhere in the vicinity of 91 to 95 years old.
And buried?
Buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which I think is kind of ironic, because he's disparaged today by a lot of people as not being a real soldier, the political general, and yet he rests in Arlington National Cemetery today. There are efforts, from time to time to try to get him reburied at Gettysburg. There's a number of enthusiasts of his who would like to see that happen. But at least with the evidence that stands today, he's probably going to rest in Arlington.
If you could talk to him, what would you ask him?
Boy, good question. Well, I think like all of us, probably the million-dollar question was, you'd go back to the morning of July 2nd, 1816, and say, Dan, what were you thinking? And tell me the truth. Don't lie to me. Tell me the truth. What were you thinking? I think if I only had one question, that would probably be it.
We've been talking with James Hessler. He is the author of this book, Sickles at Gettysburg. James Hessler, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. The time flew by, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.